Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. I wanted to give those of you who haven't subscribed on the Patreon feed or in the Western Civ 2.0 feed a quick sneak peek of the kind of stuff that I'm doing now for those who are able and willing to patronize the show. As always, it's the show's patrons that really allow this thing to keep going for as long as it has and to reach the end of the story, which, I don't know, will be couple decades from now, I'm guessing, at the rate that I'm currently progressing. But as you may have noticed, the show episodes have gotten a little bit longer. And that's required me to buy more books, more storage, all that stuff. And yeah, the ads offset a little bit of that. But if you don't like the ads, and if you'd like to throw a couple of coins my direction, just check out the links in the show notes, because you can get a free day 7 trial of Western Civ 2.0, or you can check out the Patreon page for a myriad different options that are available there. You can really support the show with only $12 a year. And for $12 a year, it really helps me out, and you get the ad-free versions. But I wanted to show you a little bit about some of the new shows that I've been putting out on the Western Civ 2.0 page. You know, when I did the original show years and years ago, I didn't really talk about Philip of Macedonia, which was a mistake. And even when I got to Alexander the Great, I think I'd covered his battles and everything in maybe 2 episodes, maybe 1. You know, here I've got an episode devoted to each of the major battles, Issus, Gaugamela, so on and so forth, as well as his various other travails. But this episode is one that I really enjoyed putting together, and this is about Philip of Macedonia and covers the beginnings of Macedonian kingdom and society and culture and all those sorts of things that really do matter, but that I didn't talk about at all the first time. And that's kind of the wonder of this second kick at the cat, I guess, as you would say. So I hope you enjoy it. This is just 1 episode, and there's, I think, 30-some episodes available on the Western Civ 2.0 podcast feed right now, and usually put another hour and a half to 2 hours worth of content out every month. So enjoy the listen of Macedonia, and if you're interested and so inclined to give us a little support, and check out the links. Macedonia lay at the fringe of the Greek world. Opinions in Greece were divided over whether the Macedonians were Greeks or barbarians. Macedonians spoke Greek, their names were Greek, and whenever they wrote something down, which wasn't always, it was in Greek. Of course, there were different dialects of Greek, and the Macedonian court spoke a different dialect than what you would have heard in the countryside in Upper Macedonia, by the way, but it would have been understandable. Ethnically, however, Macedonia was much more mixed than Greece, but culturally, I mean, Mount Olympus lay at Macedonia's southern border, and so the Macedonians worshipped the same Greek pantheon as you'd find in Athens or Sparta. The real difference was politics. Politically, Macedonia was in the minority. Monarchy was rare in the 5th and 4th centuries in Greece. It survived in Sparta, which was sort of the bizarre odd man out using that dual monarchy. But by and large, every other polis in ancient and classical Greece had some form of representative government. Granted, what this looked like varied in terms of place and time, but in general, we can say that the Greeks did not like kings. Greek city-states were inherently unstable, as we know, and warlike, as we also know. Certainly, what set the Greeks apart from, say, the Persians and Egyptians was not that they fought, but how they fought. The Greeks fought using hoplites and phalanxes. This manner of fighting, it's worth noting, was, for the moment, exclusively Greek, and our sources report that the Greeks were very proud of their hoplites. Macedonia was different. As we'll see in a moment, Philip of Macedonia is going to borrow the idea of the classical Greek phalanx and modify it to suit his needs. But he's going to do this in order to improve the fighting capability of his men, not out of a desire to be Greek. In Greece, the ruling class was effectively the hoplite class. But in Macedonia, the rulers were the Argead monarchs, and below them, the landed aristocracy, which didn't fight in phalanxes. The landed aristocracy in Macedonia fought in the cavalry, and that's going to be one of the big differences that we'll talk about, especially as we get to Alexander. So one major advantage that the Macedonians have over the Greeks is their relatively stable political system. I say relatively stable because there's going to be a lot of intrigue and there's going to be a lot of murder. But as we saw in the Peloponnesian War, Greek city-states tended to go to war quite often when it was not in their interest to do so. Athens could have effectively won the Peloponnesian War multiple times, but the war party within Athens never allowed it to, because it insisted on Sparta's total destruction, which was probably never going to happen. In Macedonia, on the other hand, the king gets to make the decision. And while that might sound less responsive than the Greek representative government, remember that monarchies work really well, especially in the pre-modern world, if you have a stable monarch. Stable from a political standpoint, at least. City-states, though, they'd never really developed in Macedonia. There were urban communities, but they were subject to the king like anywhere else. And to the Athenians, getting back to the idea of Greekness again for a second, as we're going to see, this difference in political structure is going to matter a lot more than linguistic similarities. To the Athenians, it was the monarchy that made Macedonia backward more than anything else, though they certainly had other complaints. Now, for one, another complaint, speaking, Macedonia fought alongside Persia during Xerxes' War of Conquest. But don't get me wrong, there was Macedonian cavalry at Plataea, but it fought with the Persian would-be conquerors, not with the Greeks. Of course, so did Thebes for that matter. During the Peloponnesian Wars, Macedonia became essentially just another theater of war. Macedonian monarchs took part in the conflict and switched sides frequently whenever it was in their self-interest to do so. Certainly, Macedonian kings, especially by the 5th and 4th centuries, were fans and big patrons of Greek arts. Pindar was just one of many well-known Greek poets to visit the Macedonian court, where he was treated lavishly. Macedonian kings created their own version of the Olympic Games, which some competitors traveled to all the way from Greece. Euripides, the playwright, spent a good amount of time at the Macedonian court, and even wrote one play, Archelaus, while he was there. Euripides, interestingly enough, died in Macedon in 406 BCE. Athens politely requested on several occasions that his remains be sent home, but the Macedonians never complied. So now let's turn to the meat of our story. Centuries before there was a Philip or an Alexander, the principal characters in our story for the next dozen or so episodes, there was a kingdom to the north of Greece called Macedonia. In the city-states of Greece, aristocratic families constantly jostled for position. Macedonia, by contrast, throughout the classical period, and this is so important to understand the story, was ruled by one family and one family only, the Argaids. The Argaids claim their descent from an aristocratic clan from the state or city-state of Argos, down in the Peloponnese. According to legend, representatives from Argos traveled north to found a new kingdom, Macedonia, sometime during the Greek Dark Ages, probably 7th century BCE. This family, by consequence, claimed descent through Hercules. As we have seen and will see, such illusions of grandeur, when it came to the founding person, usually a man, for different cities in the classical world was common. The Macedonians were no exception. But what matters in all of this is that the Argead right to rule was never challenged in Macedonia. Philip and his son, Alexander, you may have heard of him, would be able to launch distant campaigns without any real possibility of domestic trouble at home. Well, okay, at least challenges from outside the family, that is. There does not seem to have been a tradition amongst the ancient Argaids for the oldest son to automatically inherit the throne. Certainly, if the king had an adult son when he died, there seems to have been a strong preference for that young man to rule, but it wasn't a given. Brothers or even distant cousins might challenge for the throne. And it didn't help matters that the Argaids were quite, prolific. They practiced polygamy, and so as a result, there tended to be any number of little challengers to the throne running about. The first several centuries of Argaid rule in Macedonia remain shrouded in mystery. We know the names of many of these kings. There are a few Alexanders in there for those keeping score at home, but we know little about their rule. By and large, most Macedonian kings were concerned with dealing with the Illyrians, a native tribe which inhabited much of what I suppose we would say is modern-day Bulgaria. The Illyrians, not the distant Greeks, were the primary foe of the early Macedonians. Now, I should say, the term Illyrian was given to the various tribal people living northwest of Macedonia by the Greeks. But this is a catch-all term that encompassed a large number of tribal peoples. We know that they united around the end of the 4th century BCE, because in 496, the new Macedonian king, Aminitas III, was forced to flee his kingdom to escape an Illyrian invasion at the same time. The other neighbor we need to know about is Thessaly. In 396, Aminitas fled to Thessaly. This was the large, flat portion of northern Greece that Xerxes marched through and was often part of a Persian satrapy. But in 396, his Thessalian allies helped Aminitas return to power. Aminitas, like all Argaid kings, practiced polygamy. We, by the way, have no evidence that this was the case for the Macedonians at large, or even for the Macedonian aristocracy. Thus, it seems to have been something of a royal prerogative, something that the Argaids alone practiced. Regardless, one of Aminitas' wives gave birth to the Philip who will become Philip II in our story, Philip of Macedonia. Philip would be famous if not for his son, Alexander. Philip was born either in 382 or 383 BCE. Ancient historians tended not to bother giving someone's birth date unless it corresponded with an important event or natural phenomenon. In fact, it's worth noting right now that dates in the ancient world are a bit hazy. The Greeks reckoned time in a variety of ways, and none of them corresponded to our system of 12 solar months, which didn't get invented until Caesar implemented it in 46 BCE. So when an ancient historian gives us a date, it might have occurred very late the year before or roughly at the time indicated. We don't have any details about Philip's birth or childhood. Again, it was extremely uncommon for ancient historians to care about such things. Alexander, as we will see, is going to be the exception to the rule. Then again, Alexander the Great, my friends, is the exception to a lot of rules. Childbirth was a harrowing process in the ancient world, but Philip's mother was, let's just say, remarkable in this regard. Not only did she give birth to 3 other children, a daughter named Eurone and 2 sons named Alexander and Perdiccas, but mother and all 4 children would outlive her husband, Amynitis. Amynitis' wife was also far more forceful than most ancient women we have information about. It's widely believed that she was Illyrian ethnically. And this might explain her personality, because Illyrian women were normally more politically involved than their Macedonian counterparts. Certainly more than their Greek counterparts, who considered such ideas tantamount to insanity. Amynitis died in 370 BCE, having lived a fairly long time. Alexander II, the eldest son, succeeded to the throne. Philip was about 12 at the time. As you might remember, in 371 BCE, the city-state of Thebes inflicted a crippling defeat on Sparta. And as a result of this, Thebes began to intervene more forcefully in Thessaly. When a Theban general imposed a peace on Macedonia and the warring cities of Thessaly, young Philip found himself one of the 30 hostages sent to Thebes in order to secure his older brother's cooperation. Philip would spend 3 years in Thebes. He lived in the home of a well-connected aristocrat. He wasn't free to come and go as he pleased, but it was a pretty easy arrangement. For generations now, the Argaides had embraced especially Athenian Greek culture. So Philip already knew most of the Greek works of Greek literature and drama. Certainly he knew Homer and all the great plays and all that. He was also well versed in the art of hunting, which doubled his training for war and would have endeared him to the males in his host family. Some ancient sources claim that Philip learned a great deal in Thebes, and that those 3 years had a profound influence on him. None of those sources go into any detail, and frankly, any conclusion that Thebes quote-unquote changed Philip is 99% conjecture. What I can say is that, in Thebes, Philip would have experienced life among the elite in a leading Greek city-state. If anything, he might have experienced the ups and downs of political life within a polis. One party might have power for 1 year and not the next. That would have been very different from life in relatively stable Macedonia. Philip might also have learned how factional the Greeks were, something that he could and would use to his advantage later on. But again, this is all very much conjecture. In late 368 or early 367 BCE, King Alexander II of Macedonia was stabbed to death during a ritual dance. Although one man was executed for the crime, it is almost certain that more than one person was involved. Perdiccas, the second-born son, was not yet old enough to take over in his own right. So a man named Ptolemy of Aloras was appointed regent. Interestingly, he was another of Amynitis' sons by a different wife, and historians believe it highly likely he was involved in the murder of the previous king. Still, the upshot from all this is that Philip now found himself a little closer to the throne. During this period, Macedonia remained relatively weak, and Thebes intervened in Macedonian state policy on several occasions. Old Ptolemy didn't last very long. In 365, he was murdered either by Perdiccas himself or someone acting on his behalf. Thus, Philip's second brother became king in his own right. But for Macedonia in general, the change in brother meant nothing. Perdiccas followed the same policies as his brother and reached a treaty of friendship with Thebes. It was as a result of this treaty that Philip came home. He would never again find himself in the hands of enemies or any foreign power. At some point after returning, Philip was given charge of a region by his brother. Scholars speculate that this was to the east, facing the Thracians and other Greeks. Whether Perdiccas did this because he genuinely trusted his brother, or because he wanted him somewhere that he could keep an eye on him, we do not know. Perdiccas had an infant son at this point, so he might have viewed his brother as a potential rival. Either way, Philip would have found himself in a very active theater of war all of a sudden. This was after the Peloponnesian War and during a period of Athenian resurgence. Athens was trying hard to get Amphipolis back under its control. And Chalcidice, the region just south of modern-day Istanbul, remained a crucial stopping point on the way to the Black Sea. Perdiccas at first backed Amphipolis. Then he switched sides. Then he switched sides again. Frankly, it seems like he lost every time he switched. So, for the other combatants, it might have made more sense not to have Perdiccas on your side during the war. But this wasn't Macedonia's only problem at the time. In 360, a large army of Illyrians invaded. Perdiccas summoned a massive force of his own, and the two sides met either at the tail end of 360 or at the very beginning of 359. We do not have any major details of the battle. What we do know is that the Macedonians were crushed, losing 4,000 men. One of those was Perdiccas. He is the first known Macedonian king to have been killed in battle against a foreign foe. Perdiccas' son was far too young to rule on his own, so Philip was proclaimed king. Hindsight makes Philip the obvious choice to succeed his brother. But keep in mind, he was 22 or maybe 21 at the time, and totally unproven. There is no direct evidence that he had participated in any major military campaigns or had any military experience. What we can surmise is that the majority of Macedonian nobles agreed to his rule. This might have been pragmatic. The Illyrians were encamped in Upper Macedonia. Other tribes were chomping at the borders. This was not a time for an internal squabble. Luckily, Perdiccas' defeat and death seems to have taken place in early winter, and no one campaigned in the dead of winter, so that bought Philip a little breathing space. The Illyrians wanted to go home and enjoy the spoils of their victory. Theirs was a predatory war for financial enrichment. They weren't trying to annex Macedonia. Still, there were various stepbrothers and cousins about plotting a return and looking for allies. Philip would have some time to prepare himself, but Macedonia still looked like a kingdom on the verge of tearing itself apart. Macedonian cavalry had always been well regarded throughout the Balkans and into Greece. But their infantry was another matter, and this was another problem facing Philip. Frankly, at the time, Macedonian infantrymen weren't considered any better than any other unskilled rabble that happened to be just wandering around. A few Macedonian kings had tried to right the ship, but none had lived long enough to make it happen. It is worth noting at this stage just how financially poor Macedonia was. The land was not rich in precious metals, though there was iron. The Macedonian kings still had to mint coins in bronze, never silver. They couldn't even think about gold. Even Philip's brothers had enjoyed a treasury far poorer than those of the neighboring Illyrians. But on the other side of the coin, Macedonia remained a land of opportunity. Lower Macedonia, the part closer to Greece, had plentiful farmlands and the perfect climate for growing cereal grains. Upper Macedonia was less effective for farming, but possessed excellent pasture lands. Plus, Macedonia had plenty of timber. Compare this to Greece, which had little good farmland and was almost completely devoid of good trees by this stage. And you can see how in the right hands, Macedonia might be able to quickly move up the ladder. Plus, another benefit was that in Macedonia, the king technically owned all the natural resources. So Philip had the materials he needed to revitalize his state. He just needed to survive in order to do it, which was no small matter. But at the time, no one knew what the future held. For the moment, it seemed like Philip had merely taken control over an impoverished kingdom, surrounded by enemies, and that he would probably die young like his brothers, and the throne would just pass on to the next nobody. At the time, Macedonia was known less as a kingdom than as a resource-rich tract of land open to pillage. From the word go, Philip was determined to change things. He had time, not much, but some, and he was determined to use it. Most scholars agree that the armies which would bring Greece under his control and then march forth to conquer the Persian Empire under his son began to coalesce, even in these early months. Philip introduced new tactics and equipment. Macedon lacked a hoplite class. Hoplites were effective spearmen in their own right, and Philip recognized he simply did not have the time to train them right now. So instead, he issued them a new weapon, a sarissa. A sarissa is a pike about 16 to 18 feet long and designed to be held with both hands. It had an iron tip and an iron counterweight on the butt, which made it relatively easy for one man to control. By contrast, most hoplites used a spear around 12 to 14 feet long. The sarissa was cumbersome by comparison and useless if you were fighting alone. It was designed for groups of pikemen to fight in concert. The sarissa was also too heavy for the cumbersome hoplon shield, which Philip replaced by a smaller 2-foot diameter one. At this early stage, infantrymen in Philip's army wore no armor, so the man in the front row only really had his 18-foot-long pike to keep the enemy at bay. But even if the enemy got past his pike, the first 5 rows of a Macedonian phalanx projected their pikes out in front, making a direct assault on a mass of sarissa-wielding soldiers tantamount to suicide. Later on, Macedonian phalanxes were 8 rows deep and may have been from the start, with the first 5 rows all actively participating in combat. I once saw it described as a porcupine of death, and I think that's apt to a large extent. One Roman commander, and these were hard guys to scare, in the 2nd century BCE, described the approach of such a phalanx as the most terrifying thing he ever saw. There was nothing subtle about Philip's new formation. It was designed to smash into the enemy head-on, not conduct elaborate maneuvers on the battlefield. In this formation, the individual soldier did not need great skill with his weapon. Really, all you had to do was hold your place and thrust your sarissa. So long as gaps did not develop in the line, odds are you would be safe. It was easy for Philip to train his men to stay in formation, keep their ranks and files, and for the front row to jab with their weapons. It took only a few months to drill for such a phalanx to be proven proficient. The pikemen of Philip's later years, and of Alexander's, trained far beyond this simple beginning. They're going to be able to execute complex maneuvers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For centuries, historians have debated where Philip came up with this idea. He may well have invented the sarissa. The Thracians sometimes used long spears, but in that case the weapon was not held with two hands. So Philip's idea does seem to be something novel. Philip would have seen the hoplites practice in Thebes, where the sacred band was the elite unit of the day. But again, hoplites and the Macedonian phalanx men were not the same. It is likely that Philip borrowed some of what he had seen from the enemies around him and adapted them to his new weapon. Regardless, when the Macedonian phalanx finally debuted, it effectively made the classical Greek phalanx obsolete overnight. Greece just didn't know that yet. Alongside the phalanx, Macedonia still had excellent cavalry. There were some other specialists as well, such as javelin throwers and archers. But again, it's worth noting that around 359 BCE, no one had any idea that Philip's ideas were going to work. He was still totally unproven as a commander. His first test was around Amphipolis. Athens still wanted its colony back. Philip was determined that they not get it. In 359 BCE, an Athenian expedition landed at Methone, a city on the Macedonian coast. They had mercenaries and around 3,000 hoplites. It was a substantial force, but Athens immediately divided it into two, marching out with around half, hoping to catch Philip by surprise. He was not. Philip pounced on the diminished army and won what must have been little more than a skirmish. Still, he won. Philip knew he could not follow up on that victory yet, so he allowed the Athenians to escape. They made one failed effort to take Amphipolis, and then they sailed home. With his confidence growing, Philip decided to try and kick the Illyrians out of Upper Macedonia. He mustered an army of around 10,000 infantry and 600 cavalry, and early in 358 he marched north. At first, the Illyrians tried to negotiate, but Philip wasn't having it. He wanted his country back. So the Illyrians mustered their own army of around 10,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. The Illyrians, of course, were confident after routing Perdiccas, so little did they know what lay ahead of them. The two armies met in fairly open country, great for phalanx warfare. The Illyrians hung back, still hoping the relatively untested Macedonians would get nervous, break, and run. Philip trusted in his training and advanced. He ordered his cavalry to advance around the flanks. There's no mention of the Illyrian cavalry, so most historians assume they dismounted and fought with the infantry. It was a long battle. Both sides pushed back and forth throughout the day. Whichever side held out the longest was going to win. The Illyrians cracked first. Casualty rates in classical warfare were not high, unless one side broke and ran. The Illyrians did. So most historians calculate their losses around 70%. In other words, 7,000 men. The Illyrians now, with little choice, begged for peace. And so with one victorious battle, Philip recaptured all of Upper Macedonia. In the end, it had been a stunning first year on the throne. But Philip remained in a precarious situation. Sure, for the moment, his army was feared, but that might not last forever. The Illyrians were chastened, but would recover. So Philip made his first marriage alliance, marrying Audata, an Illyrian princess. As her dowry, Philip received significant land grants in Illyria itself and, of course, the promise of peace. Not long after, Philip took a second wife, remember the polygamy thing? Her name was Elimia. She was from Upper Macedonia. Philip was the first king in a long time to insist on total royal control over all of Upper Macedonia. The aristocracy there was, quote-unquote, invited to court as companions of the king, weakening their local ties. There doesn't seem to have been any major opposition to Philip's policy of effectively annexing Upper Macedonia and placing it firmly under Argead control. And he cemented his control by forcing peasants to abandon pastoralism and move to cities and towns, where they could be farmers and would be much easier to control. To speed this process along, Philip brought in settlers from Lower Macedonia. None of this was instant or inevitable, but it worked. As much as we remember Alexander as a great general, we have to always admire Philip as a great diplomat. Now, don't get me wrong, Philip was a great general too, and in the classical world, diplomacy and force were intertwined. Philip wanted to make Macedonia more secure by dominating his neighbors. He wasn't interested in being friends with them. In 358 BCE, his next target was Thessaly. Thessaly at the time was essentially divided into two political organizations. One was centered around the city of Pherae and controlled the coastline. The other was landlocked and more interested in the growing power of Thebes than anything Philip was up to. Hence, Thessaly was politically divided in 358, just as Macedon had been during Philip's youth, and Philip was determined to take advantage of the situation. He did this first through just more marriages. He married a noble from Pherae for his third wife, and one from the interior of Thessaly for his fourth. These two marriages gave Philip connections with the aristocracy of Thessaly. For the moment, this did nothing other than make an attack from Thessaly less likely. Not out of the question, just less likely. Before the end of 357, Philip had taken another wife, Olympias. While just one of Philip's wives at this point, she would become the most important wife later on, as she is the mother of Alexander the Great. She was a fierce personality, to say the least. During the Wars of the Successors, she is going to lead her own armies. According to legend, Philip fell in love with Olympias at first sight before he even married any of his other wives, though this could just be a post facto story penned to prop up her importance in the Alexander narrative. As with many things associated with Alexander, it can be hard to divorce fact from fiction. For example, Olympias is alleged to have given birth to Alexander on the exact same day in 356 BCE that the great temple of Artemis in Ephesus, one of the wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground. While it might be amusing to think that the goddess was so distracted by Alexander's death that she let her own temple burn down, historians today think it unlikely both events happened on the same day. Turning to Philip's court for a moment, historians get only a few glimpses of life there. And these tend to be negative because they're all written by Greeks. Certainly, Philip was absent from court more than he was there. He went on campaign every year, but he did have substantial palaces at both Pella and Virginia. Each palace had significant quarters for Philip's wives. And there were few slaves in Macedonia, but plenty of living space for servants. One thing I do want to note at this point is that at court, Philip was always attended by what were called royal pages. These were the teenage sons of powerful Macedonian nobles. Philip increased their number dramatically during his reign to give himself yet more leverage over these aristocrats. Alexander's friends would come almost exclusively from this group. But for now, I want to leave the narrative there in 357 and pick it back up as Philip works to flex Macedonia's military might with some mixed results.